Hello, welcome to our third and last webinar. For those who join us for the first time, I'm Marta Ehers and I'm a part of the team organizing Greenhouse Challenge. I'm curious if some of you joining us today have been following the webinars last week. If yes, could you put yes in the chat box? No, I don't see anybody? Okay, well, nice to see you for the first time then. Today we are in a very special location. It's a green studio, the studio where MOOCs of Wageningen University are produced. And for this last webinar, we have also a special guest, and that's Gert Spaargaren. And he's a professor for sustainable lifestyles and patterns of consumption in the environmental policy group of Wageningen University. Welcome, Gert. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Okay. Now, Gert is also one of the main driving forces behind the Greenhouse Challenge. So I would like to thank you very much for your enormous contribution. Gert is going to discuss different ways in which urban cities and consumers can become engaged in the urban greenhouses. His presentation is in 4 blocks, and after each of the blocks, we encourage you to ask the questions. So please take your time and ask any questions during his presentations already. Well, I think Gert is going to also have some questions for you, so be ready to answer some of the questions from him. And I hope you will have a lot of fun. And I give the floor to Gert.
Thank you, Marta. Indeed, I like to have also not just a presentation about this very interesting topic, the social dimension of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge, but I also want to have a more interactive presentation with you. You are in different places of the world, and you have been kind of discussing this topic very frequently already among yourself in the teams. So I would love to have some kind of written inputs, some chats that you send to Marta, and then Marta will bring it into the presentation, so that it's not just a lecture, but it is more or less a brainstorm that can also develop in certain directions. I will introduce the different blocks with a few remarks, and for those remarks I prepared the slideshow. I think it's about 15 slides, so I think we will have 10 minutes presentation for each block, and then I hope 5 minutes discussion and question. So in the end, I think we will overall have 1.5 hours or something like that in the studio, which is a very nice place to be indeed in Wageningen. Okay, so let's start this topic. As Marta said, it's about the role of citizens, consumers in the urban greenhouse. So how do they connect to this project that you are going to design and develop? It is an urban greenhouse, so we talk about urban population, and there are not so many examples yet available of the possible roles that people can have in urban food production, because the urban challenge is new in its kind. It's not a normal kind of form of urban food production. It is a kind of high-tech vertical farming, vertical agriculture experiment. And with that experiment, we also have to design the new roles for the citizens in that greenhouse. So that's what my talk is about, to give you some inspirations and some questions on how could you connect your greenhouse design in a proper way to the urban environment, the social environment in the urban setting. So first, it's important to notice that we are talking about urban food and urban food production. And at the moment, urban food is very hot. We can also recognize that from the response to this green challenge. There's a huge amount of publicity around it. There is interest in the topic. And I think it fits very well in this time. In the contemporary time, food is hot and food is trendy. And especially food in the city is kind of discussed very frequently. Just to give you a few examples, we talk a lot about food labeling and certification. we talk about the so-called last food miles. So how do you get your food from the supermarket and bring it home? Do you do that by car or by bike? We talk a lot about food waste, which is a kind of emerging topic because a lot of urban food is being wasted, and it's a pity because it brings a lot of climate impacts, for example, that could be avoided. And then food is also discussed in very trendy topics like food sharing, collaborative food production and consumption. So we could have some discussion and examples about that later on in the lecture. But what I want to argue is you are lucky to have this urban greenhouse design as it is, because food in the city is a heavily debated topic with a lot of interest from policymakers and from society in general. So food is hot among consumers, but also among policymakers in cities. And food is kind of discovered in the agenda for sustainable cities because cities, they recognize that the early emphasis they had on energy and also on mobility, that actually food was more or less neglected in the sustainable agenda. And nowadays, over the past 5 years, I think we are making up for this lack of interest for example, the impact, the climate impact of food. And now you can see that cities that are member of the so-called sustainable city networks, like the C40 and the ICLEI, that they are kind of investing a lot in urban food. And with that, they try to connect to consumers, to the citizens, and to convince them that sustainable food is an interesting and important topic for the city. Cities make food policies in a very proactive way, and they say, well, it's even better than national politics sometimes because cities are closer to citizens. So cities are, as kind of policymakers, they are more flexible, they are more pragmatic, and they are very citizen-oriented when you compare it to nation-state politics. So they say, well, we are the most suitable kind of policy level to discuss sustainable food in the city. And I think they do it for good reasons, because as I said, food consumption and production has kind of similar impacts in urban areas when compared to mobility and energy. And we used to think that food was too small, so food is not very important for, let's say, climate emissions. And it turns out that that is a misunderstanding. Food is much more, has much higher impacts for climate change than originally thought so. So food consumption is trendy and has a lot of interest among urban population, but also among urban policymakers. So that is my first kind of statement that I want to discuss with you. So what is your feeling about not just the urban greenhouse as a technical design, as an object, as a kind of production method, but as an idea to bring food into the city? Are you aware of the fact that food is much welcomed and that it is a kind of upgraded all the time in the agenda of the cities at this moment? So this is the first thing that I want to share with you, and of which I would like to have some responses. And Marta is already looking at her laptop, because if you just type some questions or comments for us, then she will just bring it out.
Yeah, so Josemar typing. Josemar, do you have any ideas to share with us? How is food present in your city? You are at Boku, right?
So maybe when you think about it and maybe discuss it with your fellow students around the table.
So Alessia, I think, Alessia, you are also from Boku, right? Alessia says, for sure, more examples of urban gardening.
Yeah.
In Vienna, I guess.
Yes. I was a few months ago. I was lecturing at Boca University, and we had groups of students there working on urban food. And I know from experience that food in Vienna is very popular. And also the students there, they are very much into the discussion on how to make food consumption more sustainable within the canteens of the university, but also the interest in urban gardening. It's very prominent. But as yet, I didn't see in Vienna a real urban greenhouse. So there's some room for initiatives there.
Okay, I have watched today, this morning actually, a video of two Austrian architects who are very seriously thinking about designing an urban greenhouse in Vienna.
Okay.
I'm going to share it
Okay.
also online on YouTube channel.
Good.
But actually, Alessia is from Italy, and she added much more people joining together and much aware about food production in Italy.
In Italy?
In Italy, yeah.
Of course. So we all know that Italy is special when it comes to food. And we can learn a lot from experience in Italy. I'm not aware of major kind of urban greenhouses that have been designed for Milan or whatever, but I'm sure that if they are there, they have this typical Italian touch to it. That's what you can expect. Okay, so...
And I see also Josemar. He has a question. I would like to know more about the potential user that you envision for urban greenhouses.
Yeah, that's actually the next topic that I will discuss and introduce. So I can just go on and make a start with that. Thank you for that question.
Yes.
Because when you look at the urban greenhouse then and urban food production and consumption more in general, I would argue that citizen consumers, they are important co-creations of these kind of urban food initiatives. And when you talk about co-creation, so that's a very broad concept. We have been developing a MOOC about this topic recently here at Wageningen University, and I shared some of the video from that MOOC, and I would invite you to take a wider look at the materials that we developed in this MOOC on co-creating sustainable cities, because there you find a lot of empirical examples about possible roles of citizens and citizen consumers as co-creators of urban food production and consumption. And in that MOOC, we make a distinction between two basic roles for citizens. First, they can co-create food politics of the city. And second, they can co-create what we call socio-technical systems that are used for the production and consumption for food. So that is two different roles, and I will just elaborate them later on. But you can imagine that if you are a general citizen that you are voting for a new city a municipal administration, that you just check whether they have a lot of interest in promoting sustainable food in the city, and that in that way you are kind of active as a citizen, a political voter, putting pressure on the municipal authorities to come up with new initiative, for example, to support an urban greenhouse development. That would be kind of a very active policy that the city can develop. That's a different way of kind of getting involved in the urban greenhouse as co-created when you compare that with going to the greenhouse itself and being involved in, let's say, producing urban food. So then, as a citizen consumer, you are more active in developing the social technical system of the urban greenhouse. So I think for your challenge, you have to look at both the political involvement surrounding sustainable food in the city and this kind of co-creation of the social technical system. But I would say the second dimension is the one that we are going to discuss at most today and in more detail, because there we have not so much research and information available yet. And that's why we have this webinar, to just get the discussion going and to share with you the ideas that are there. But I must say it's only in the beginning of development of a discourse, because we have not so much experience with high-tech urban greenhouses and the role of citizens in this kind of food production. So there is really something new, and that's why it's called a challenge, of course, because it's up to you to come up with ideas on how you could do that. And I will just share with you some thoughts that I had on this topic because, as Marta said, I've been involved in development of the Green Challenge in Wageningen, and this was my favorite topic because I'm trained as a social scientist, a sociologist. So we did look at also the technical aspects and the food production and the environmental aspects, but I really like to share with you my thoughts about, well, what possible roles for citizens. So when you look at the urban greenhouse as a social technical system for the production and consumption for urban food, then I would say it is important to think about roles for citizen consumers as active roles. So we don't just give information and say, well, we developed an urban greenhouse, it's now just around the corner and you will find a parking space there or something like that. That's too passive. That's not an active role. It's also not enough to say, well, we just convince the citizens in general that this is a good project and we give them a leaflet and we have 2 meetings and that's done, because then we have done the kind of information and education campaigns on the greenhouse. No, I think we should go one step further and talk about how can citizens be active as co-creators of this kind of urban greenhouse. What are they going to do with the urban greenhouse? So actually, are they going to visit it? Are they go there to kind of co-produce food and to work with the people in the urban greenhouse? So are they taking their children there to have some food fun? Are they going there for doing some cooking workshops? So I really think that when you talk about roles for citizen consumers in urban greenhouses, you have to think about active roles and about commitment that goes not just via reading information and talking, but doing things, getting green hands, getting green fingers. That's what it is about. And I think it's important to discuss it in that proactive and active way, because if you don't do it, then the question will be, well, why do you put such a greenhouse in a city? Because the space is scarce in a city, it's very expensive to do so. So why don't you put the greenhouse somewhere in the rural areas? When you put it in the urban space, I think the only legitimation for doing that is that you say, well, it's important because we connect with our food production to the direct environment, to the city itself, to the citizens. So I would say active roles for citizens in the urban greenhouse, they legitimize the fact that the greenhouse is in urban space. And I would like to know from you whether you agree with this statement. So, because it's important in how much time and effort you spend as a team on developing this social dimension. You can just say, well, we make an urban greenhouse and we forget about the social dimension. And I would say, ooh, you risk losing very important points in the jury in the end, because for the team here in Wageningen and for the whole kind of challenge team, this social dimension, this kind of engaging citizens with the greenhouse, has been a very important dimension from the beginning. So it's not just about food and sustainability, it's also about engagement of citizens. So my question for you is, did you recognize it so far? Did you discuss it in your team? And do you agree that these roles, that they are very important for the, let's say, the success of the project overall?
Okay. So I'm looking forward to your answers, and in the meantime, I will ask her 2 questions. First comes from Chi Yu Lin, from Wageningen team, actually, tardigrade. And she asks if you have an example of engaging people in urban greenhouse, and also what might be the obstacles.
Yeah. It's always, if you ask for questions, then you get questions about topics that are later on in the presentation.
Oh, so it's coming. It's
so
coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
Of course, but I will provide some examples and also tell a bit about student research that has been done on the topic so far. But first, I want to discuss with you more in general whether you recognize the importance of these roles for citizens, and that kind of the success of your project is very much depending on how well you are able to engage citizens with your project.
Yeah. So Alessia from the Italian team says, not completely. I believe social inclusion is of pivotal importance, but I don't think we are producing in the cities just for this reason. I think urban food production can really be more sustainable and reduce pressure on the countrysides. That's it.
Okay, well, this is not just something that is true or not true. I slightly disagree with you because the urban space is much kind of more scarce because of the trend of urbanization. It's expected also in the next future to become a lot of pressure on the urban space. And I think if we then say, well, we want to use part of urban space for food production in the city, then many Wageningen experts would, in the food sector and in the agricultural sector, would say, well, this is just symbolic food production. It's only very small overall contribution to the food production for feeding the world population. And then my response always is, well, it is important to connect people to food production, because if it is done out there in the rural countryside, so far away from the city, then people don't know how food is produced, they don't know what they eat, they don't know about the sustainability of that food. So you have to bring food closer to where people live and kind of have their daily activities. And that's why the urban greenhouse is a challenge, to put it in the city, but then invite people to come and take a look. And I hope that you agree with me that this is a very exciting topic, to think about ways to seduce people to come and do something with food in the greenhouse.
Okay, I have one more answer from the team Boku, Josemar and Sarah. They say, our team understands...
Yeah, I know them.
Oh, you know them,
Yeah.
Great. Our team... Sorry. Okay. Our team understands the role and is planning to introduce this kind of experiences for education purposes. And Sarah adds, exactly, we are really aware about the engagement with citizens. However, it is a little difficult to find ways for including active roles for them. So maybe you could give us some information about the culture, what they like. It's about Amsterdam.
Oh, okay.
People
Yeah.
in Amsterdam.
Yes, let's then go to the next part of the presentation, because that's the topic that I wanted to discuss there. If you wonder what kind of roles could be designed for urban citizens and urban consumers in the greenhouse, then it's important that you define the greenhouse as a social thing. So you could say the greenhouse is a physical thing, it's a construction, it's a building with materials and infrastructures, but I would say urban greenhouse is a set of social practices that are enacted or performed at particular time and place. So think about what people are doing in and around an urban greenhouse. So what could you do there? So of course it's obvious that we talk about food production. So I will sorry, no. Oh, that slide is later on, sorry. It's obvious that you can go there for participating in the production of urban food, but you could also think about having a shop there where you sell the products that are produced in the greenhouse. So then it's about buying and selling, trading food. You could also think about having a kind of farmers market connected to it. You could think about having cooking workshops in or around the urban greenhouse. So that's kind of up to you as a team to design your urban greenhouse for 1 or 2 or 5 or 20 of these kind of social practices that are all different in character. So if you just go for example, there are urban greenhouses now that produce 50,000 units of lettuce every year. And they are very successful, but they do produce only one thing, and they do it in a high-tech, very efficient way, and they do it just to save on logistics, so that they don't have to transport the crops from the rural areas into the city. But that's a very kind of, well, I would say, production-oriented view of the urban greenhouse. It can be a business model that works, but I would say in a social dimension, that would not be a very attractive design for me. So I would not go for 50,000 units of one kind of crop and then make that as efficient as possible for water and energy and waste, and then say, well, here we have kind of a new kind of food production. I think the urban greenhouse as a social thing is about variety, is about local food culture, is about doing things with citizens. So it's not just one kind of social practices, namely production. It's also kind of consumption, like I said, cooking or storing or, well, do things with food. So that would be my first suggestion. So have a brainstorm on where you list a number of social practices that could be enacted in your urban greenhouse. And also maybe some social practices that are not possible in your greenhouse. For example, if you have a very high-tech hydroponic or whatever environment, then people cannot go in there without proper clothing. You can see the people with the mask and the white coats that are in some of these high-tech urban farms. That's not something I think about when I talk about, okay, bringing citizens into the urban greenhouse to co-produce food. And there you have to make choices. So if you go for, let's say, food safety and hygiene standards that are so high that normal people cannot participate in the production, you have to make that very clear. So you can use parts of your urban greenhouse to close that off for urbanites and say, well, they can come and take a look, but they can only be active in the cooking workshops or in selling the food or something like that. So you have to think about that. So what practices are possible in and around the urban greenhouse for people to participate in, and which practices are not open to lay people, to citizens. So that's the first suggestion that I would do. The second one is then, if you have identified a number of these practices, then think about possible roles that people could have. So are they, let's say, very prominent and leading in some roles in producing, for example, food? Are they doing the decisions on to bring water and nutrients and energy, fertilizers to the crops? Are they making the decisions themselves as citizens and consumers? Or are there experts doing that for them? And do they just come in when the harvesting is going on, or even when later on there is cooking with this food? So you have to think about how active or how passive is the role of the citizen in these practices. So that's, as a general start, I would present to you. Think about your urban greenhouse as a social project that consists of a number of practices that are enacted at a particular place and a particular time, and think then about possible roles of people in these practices. Again, if you have questions for me here on this topic, for example, the social practices, that is a kind of a concept that comes from sociology, from the social science. And I can imagine that you have some, if you're not trained as a social scientist, that you want to read some more about it. And in the end of my presentation, I have some kind of references and literature for you where you can just start reading about social practices. Okay, then we go on to so the main topic. I have to stand like this. Is that during this webinar, I would suggest that the key topic is that we discuss examples of social practices that are in, around, or related to the urban greenhouses, and that for those practices that you think about possible roles for citizen consumers. Now what I will do in the next 2 blocks is that we go a little bit deeper in potential roles for citizen consumers in certain practices. And I will give some examples for that. And then I start with, well, the common idea. If you talk about roles for citizen consumers in urban food production, you have something like this. This is a nice guy who was watering plants. So that's the kind of things that people think about when you talk about roles for citizens in urban greenhouses. But if you have a thing like this, a high-tech, production site for urban food, then it's not just this cozy guy with this, this is the informal thing that we know from urban food production so far, which is kind of close to the people and very much, well, let's say, informal. And with the urban greenhouse, we are kind of thinking about having food production in a more high-tech and more efficient way. And then you kind of move away more or less from this more informal and personal engagement. And that's the problem that we have to confront. So how can we kind of design more high-tech roles for citizen consumers in the urban greenhouse? For example, this would be an old picture, I would say, that doesn't fit, but it's my intuition. It's just a suggestion for you to discuss. It doesn't fit very well high-tech food production in an urban greenhouse, because for reasons of safety, you can see this would not be a good setup, because then we would have the quality control coming around, and then the urban greenhouse would be shut down. So it's good to have that as a discussion point for you in the team. Are you thinking more about this, or are you thinking more about this kind of stuff? And how does that kind of influence the design of your urban greenhouse? So we call it low-tech or high-tech forms of urban farming. And you can have everything, low-tech, high-tech, and in between is possible, because you, as a team, you are the one that takes the challenge. You want to convince the jury. But I think it is, overall, it will be more high-tech than we have experienced so far. So that's my guess. But it's up to you. But this is the variation. That's what I want to bring. And we know about roles of citizen consumers in urban food production, but they are most in the low-tech versions. That's the roles that we know best about. Because people come there and they meet their neighbors and they socialize and they talk about the kids and they raise some tomatoes and they take them home and they are happy. So that kind of, I just make a bit of a caricature of that, but this is what we know from, let's say, urban food networks and participants in that so far from the literature. And with this urban greenhouse, we just put it kind of a challenge to that kind of participation. We say, well, okay, we want as a complement, not to replace it, because I think many people like it that way, but there are maybe other groups of people that also would like to participate in this more high-tech form of urban food production.
Yeah, I think this topic has been coming back in other webinars as well.
Okay.
Yeah, quite some people were asking, how do you make those high-tech greenhouses accessible for the people?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think students are not alone in this, because I participated in several conferences where all these kind of people from the industry and from the, let's say, the technology providers, and they think about these urban greenhouses without thinking about consumers' roles. They just say, well, no, this is the thing. Yeah. And then in the end, there always is a vital debate in the end of the seminars or the conference. Yeah, how do we include citizen consumers?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think, there is a huge task ahead of this.
Yeah. Well, the example that I have seen the most accessible was that you actually separate the food production are behind this kind of glass wall. So you can have a look, but you don't enter. And in the middle you have a kind of atrium, and the atrium you can kind of enjoy and socialize.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine that you you just say we have different functions for the urban greenhouse, and that you make one segment or section where there are very low standards of food safety, and that they are close to this informal urban farming,
Yeah.
and that is just a part of the urban greenhouse, and that you say for social reasons, for reasons of socializing, this is set apart from the rest.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And I think another way is education, as they do it, for instance, in Den Haag
Yeah.
with urban
Yeah.
farmers.
Yeah. Yeah, they invite people to come and visit the greenhouse, but then as a tourist, I
Yeah,
would say.
exactly.
And
yeah.
if you talk
yeah.
about active roles and let's say co-constructing and co-creating the urban greenhouse,
Yeah.
I think that's too passive.
Yeah.
Because then you are sent home with a leaflet, and
Yeah.
then they say, okay,
Yeah.
we are kind of so modern and we are so sustainable. But I think it's important that citizens identify with it and that they participate in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a question. So far, we didn't discuss about the trade-off between high tech and low tech, but definitely it is a challenge for us because of our focus is, because they have a focus on education. So that's one comment, and another one is: should we think about what multifunction the greenhouse can provide? So
Yes.
that's more about the
I think one of the discussions we had in our team also had to do with kind of non-food functions for urban greenhouses. Because if you think about, let's say, farmers that do also include care functions, so that there are people working on the farm because for social and health reasons, they pay for participating in the farm production, but they are not there to produce food, but they are there to kind of to pick up their lives again, to kind of think about what they have been going through. And so it's a kind of more a institution of care and social function there. I think in the urban greenhouse you could do things like that, but then it should always be a combination of different functions. And I think it would be a challenge to design an urban greenhouse that has the nice set of social practices that go together very well. So sometimes food production and, let's say, care can go together very well. And in some other respects, it's not possible.
But in case of Belma Bias, students can also include the allotment gardens, so like the open spaces that are outside.
Yeah.
So
So that you kind of discuss the functions within the urban greenhouse in relation to what is in the direct environment. And that you see it as one kind of project. Yeah, very good. Okay, shall we go on to more kind of concrete, because so far I have talked in a very abstract way, and now I want to talk about food as a connector. So my main topic is that you have different ways to appeal to citizen consumers. You can appeal to them as kind of food consumers, or, and that's the second block, that's to follow the food block, you can appeal to them as because they are sustainable citizens and they want to make the city more sustainable in general. So first talk about food as a connector. Well, I think as a team you do well in, and there was already a question about that, to look at the social environment that is in the direct neighborhood of the urban greenhouse. So in Amsterdam, we identified the place and we know what kind of people are kind of supposed to live in the neighborhood of the urban greenhouse. So I think it makes a difference of whether they are high or low income people, whether they are of different cultural backgrounds, because with an Italian population has a different taste for food when compared to Dutch people, who have very bad taste for food, I must say. And so make a food profile. So when you are kind of familiarizing yourself with the place in Amsterdam, just find out what kind of people are going to live there and what do I know about their preference for food. What actually are they eating and producing? Are they used to raising food in their own gardens? Are they already active as food consumers in all kind of networks? So I think look at both the food system in place in Amsterdam and look at the food profile of the consumers themselves. That would be my suggestion as a first step. Find out whether there are data available about that. And if not, just go and ask and find out, because we have several people, like Jan Willem van der Schans. I don't know whether they have met him already.
Yes, he was at the first.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Jan Willem knows a lot about food profiles of the place in and around the bias in Amsterdam. And I think also there is social science research on, let's say, how the multicultural society that Amsterdam is, because in Amsterdam we have 160 nationalities living together.
More, yeah.
So there is ample room for experimenting, I would say, with the cultural dimension of food.
Yeah.
Because there you can find niche markets that some segments of the population would be very interested to participate in.
Yeah, this aspect was also discussed in one of the introductory lectures. I think you can look back the presentation of Gert Spaargaren,
Oh yeah.
and
Okay.
also the the short video of Jan Willem van der Schans.
Yeah. Okay. And here in the next slide. Yeah. Can you bring it to the front for me? Because this slide is kind of from a master thesis student report, Erik Bos, and he did last year with me a research in the Netherlands on the possible roles that people have in glass houses in where they grow urban food. But I must say that in that thesis report, we only looked at low-tech urban greenhouses. So I think it's nice to take a look at the report, because he talks a lot about the social practices that people do in urban greenhouses, but he didn't provide examples for the high-tech urban greenhouse that you are going to develop, I think. But what you can see from this picture is that you find different kind of social practices of engaging with food, with urban food. So of course you can start with here. So you can look at eating food in restaurants in the surrounding of the urban greenhouse, because this is part of the food system that is in place there. So if you have a lot of, let's say, special restaurants that have a special menu, and that gives you possibilities to kind of raise food in your urban greenhouse that could go through to those restaurants, then you just connect to citizen consumers, not directly, but via their role as visitors and when they go eating out, for example. And I think when you take a look at the food system in Amsterdam, you can see that it is a very large variety of restaurants, and maybe you could play around a little bit with that, how you can provide those restaurants with kind of urban food that comes from, let's say, the bias greenhouse, that I think would be a selling point for all these alternative restaurants that we have in Amsterdam. And also the Amsterdam population is very keen on this kind of novelties. So that would be one example. You could also indeed think about not just producing the food, because that's more high-tech and for safety reasons not accessible to citizens, but you could say the harvesting of the food and the selling it out, so the selling and the buying of the food, that could be a kind of practices that you open up for citizen consumers, so that you, for example, have a local food corporation. Like we see in the energy world, we have energy corporations that work at the neighborhood level. So you could also think about, is there a food corporation or a food network that would be interested to kind of take on some functions in my urban greenhouse? So especially, I would say the harvesting and the buying and the selling of the food, that would be a strong point to look at. because then, as Marta said, it's not just the greenhouse itself, but also direct surroundings. You could kind of see whether there is some in-between space that's not restricted for safety reasons, and where you can do kind of selling and buying of food without entering the greenhouse itself.
Yeah, and bias is going to be very, especially the one part of the bias is going to be a very interactive, very social, open
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of outsourcing
Yeah.
your buying and selling to a group of people that you think have special relevance
Yeah.
for your urban greenhouse. So a
Yeah.
food network or a food corporation,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. Yeah. So these examples, oh, sorry, they just explore a number of food-related social practices. I take one more, preparing food at home. That means when you look at cooking fresh food, then there is something special to it. So if you buy food in a supermarket or you buy it in your urban greenhouse, I think that should be a significant difference. So there should be reasons why you should go for food to the urban greenhouse. And I would say it could be that it's close by and that you like the people there. But of course, the reason should be that you want the kind of food that is produced there. And because you use that food for preparing your meal, your dinner, for your family, your friends. So I would say thinking about niche markets is not just an economic thing, it's also kind of social-cultural thing. What are people doing in the kitchens where I can connect to with my urban greenhouse? So I think taking food home and use it to prepare the food, I think that's a very obvious role that I would kind of think about when designing your greenhouse. So could people come there and take some food that they would like to prepare at home? And if so, how is it with the seasonality of that food? How is it with the freshness of that food? The taste, so people could expect particular taste. And could that be food that is very relevant for people with certain cultural backgrounds? So this is a little bit talking about food as connector to the urban greenhouse. I think we should take a short pause to see whether there are some questions on this one.
Yes, are there any questions?
So have you been discussing already
Yeah.
what kind of food you are going to produce in this urban greenhouse?
There was a question, can you give us some examples how to realize the citizen identity in an urban greenhouse?
How to realize or how to...
Yeah, realize the citizen identity, to show how to reflect the identity of the citizens in a urban greenhouse.
In the urban greenhouse, yeah. I think that's what I was hinting at when discussing this idea to make a kind of food profile of the consumers that live in the neighborhood around the greenhouse. So if you know what they do with food, then you more or less kind of make their identities in food. So are they the food lovers? Are they the alternative food movement, the slow food people? Are they the vegetarians? Are they the people that normally go for fair trade? So there are many members of the food consumer family. And to know this family a little bit means that you know the identities that you can kind of use to say, well, this is typically something that would fit my design.
Yeah.
And this one is kind of less important.
Okay. And do you think seasonality is important? Because, of course, in an urban greenhouse, you can produce without minding the seasons. But
Yeah.
do you think it's important to keep the seasonality for the sake of involving
Yeah.
citizens?
That's up to the teams to because I think it's part of your design. You can indeed do both. You can say, well, normally a greenhouse is an opportunity to just do away with seasonality because you have kind of constant production circumstances. Throughout the year, you have the same kind of light, the same kind of energy and warmth. So I would say it's a strength of the urban greenhouse that they can produce food that normally would not be available at this short distance in a fresh way. But you could also say, well, I design an urban greenhouse that make use of seasonality, because seasonality for me is very important in sustainability in general. But then you would just come up with finding a good reason for doing that.
Yeah.
So if for educational reasons you think we should play with seasonality, because then people better connect to the real food world, I think that's also a good argument.
Okay.
So it could be both.
There is one more question. Do you see the role of citizens like as something sporadic or something recurrent? Is it something that is permanent?
It's about the frequency of interaction.
Yeah. So for Josemar gives here example. I can join a cooking lesson, but maybe for school kids, they have to come over along the whole year to learn different things.
Yeah. I think that has to do with identifying the kind of what I call the social practices. So if you talk about schools and food education practices, then I would say they have, during the year, they have a program that they regularly visit the greenhouse, that they have an online connection with cameras that are in the greenhouse that inform them about how the food is kind of developing, how it is growing. And they just kind of use the greenhouse as a kind of complement to the school garden, where normally also kids learn how to raise food. And I think there's a lot of space for variation in frequency of visits to the greenhouse. Some things you can do online, some things you can only do properly when people are actually visiting the place. And I think it's up to the teams to come up with a good balance in that.
Can you also imagine that the people are actually involved in the maintenance of the greenhouse?
Yes, we'll come to that later.
Okay,
yes,
nice.
Definitely, because there is no limits to the fantasies, because the urban greenhouse, it's the ultimate urban greenhouse that they have to design. And I think that makes it interesting for you as a team, that you can say, well, what is the frequency of the visits of this target group of consumers that we just come up with? And you should not limit yourself to only one target group. I think make it as wide as possible, because in general, I would say the jury on the social dimension would be more convinced if you have frequent interaction with lots of students, lots of groups, instead of very incidental interaction with only one or two groups. So I think how broad you make your opportunities for participating, that brings you extra points, but also extra cost.
Yeah, if people don't have green fingers.
Yes, of course, that's it. Yeah. Well, we'll come to that also later, but this is a very good question. Yeah.
Okay.
So shall we go on to the next topic?
I think so.
Because I think next to food as connector, I think sustainability or circularity is an important topic to kind of motivate people to come to an urban greenhouse. Because this urban greenhouse is a challenge for how they do with energy, how they do with water, so closed water systems, and with energy we have LED lights and all these kind of artificial lighting. So they don't make use only of daylight, but they have combinations of, let's say, lightning, artificial lighting and daily light. And I think with that, the urban greenhouse is not just a food thing, it's also a sustainability thing. And it is sustainability for in two ways. So how to design the urban greenhouse as a unit that in itself is circular for energy, for water, for waste, etc. So I think that would be the conventional way to do it. I think what we expect you as a challenge team to do is to also look at how this greenhouse is embedded in the energy system of the city, in the water system of the city, in the waste system of the city, in the transport and mobility system of the city. So how does the greenhouse connect to that kind of systems? I think that's very important to think about, because then you make a full picture of sustainability and circularity. So you need to look into the profile of the urban energy, water and transport systems and make some calculations there on how your kind of design will score for the criteria on circularity here. That's the technical part. If you then look at the social part of it, then I would say, yeah, also citizens, they are involved in energy, in water, in mobility, and in waste. And this is also, they have existing routines and roles that makes it possible for you to connect to with your urban greenhouse design. The obvious example that's already mentioned several times, I guess, is that you have PV solar cells on the roof of the houses in the neighborhood, and that you ask the citizens to make a contract with the urban greenhouse that they will just deliver the surplus renewable energy that they produce with their own PV cells to the urban greenhouse. It's good for them to use the urban greenhouse as a kind of storage function, where they can just kind of get rid of their extra renewable energy, because otherwise they will not get a high price in the net. And when they deliver it to the urban greenhouse, I think the urban greenhouse can say, well, this tomato is produced with renewable energy that is produced in the neighborhood itself. So I think this is a very challenging connection with citizen consumers. And this is not just so for energy, it's also for water system. The harvesting of rainwater is something that the urban greenhouse could profit from, but also citizens could make use of it and take part in it. And the same is true for waste. You got composting waste. You can do it in the garden of the individual homes, or you can do it in the neighborhood, or you can do it in your greenhouse. And you can just mix organic waste from households with organic waste from the greenhouse, for example. So all these kind of circularity or sustainability practices are also a way to connect to citizen consumers and how they are engaged in it. And I think the greenhouse design, as it will be judged by the jury, will look at the sustainability and circularity and low carbon, climate friendliness, etc., in a very serious way. So I think it would be innovative if you say, well, I just not only designed an urban greenhouse that is circular and also a neighborhood that is profiting from it, but that you say, well, we use the circularity argument to connect to citizen consumers. I think that brings you bonus points. So this is about, I had one slide, sorry, with some examples of how citizens are at this moment already involved in this kind of circularity practices. So producing and storing renewable energy at home, especially the storing of energy. I think there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment. So there are batteries that are produced by Tesla and other producers that are offered to kind of family homes. There are batteries that are more at neighborhood level. And I think the urban greenhouse could be a huge battery, both providing energy or consuming energy if it's a surplus on energy from citizens. And the other examples I already mentioned. So time for questions again.
Yeah.
So
We have one question. We have two questions. One is, what do you see as a more important function of the urban greenhouse? Is it cost-efficient production of food, or is it engaging citizens using high-tech?
Normally I would say, what do you think yourself? Because this is a question that is a matter of prioritizing different functions of the greenhouse. So of course there should be what we call a business model behind it that is kind of doable, that is positive. And you also had a presentation on sustainable business models. So I think it should not be an urban greenhouse that just lives on subsidies. I think that's would not be a sustainable design in the long run. But I think just looking at cost-effective production in the classical way, in terms of rationalization of food production, means producing more food with less inputs with Hightech, with just kind of to produce as much food as possible. I think that's the old paradigm, and I would say the urban greenhouse could also fit in the new paradigm of thinking about food in different ways.
Yeah. I think that's also the point that Jan Willem van der Schaans brought in his first lecture.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Good.
Yeah. And there's a question. Do you think the urban greenhouse in Burma Bias will be used by the people living in the surrounding neighborhoods?
That we don't know yet, of course, because the neighborhoods are still under development. But if you think about that it is in Amsterdam, and the sketch that I gave at the opening, Amsterdam is very active as food city, is very active in engaging also citizens with the food policy agenda.
Yeah.
I think the tower that they make into the urban greenhouse will be a very popular item. It will be an icon for this urban food sustainability. So I think there will be a lot of interest.
Okay.
That's my guess, but it's something I hope you are able to explore yourself when you visit Amsterdam.
Yes, we don't. It's still tentative.
Tentative,
Yeah.
because at least we will use all kind of media to inform the teams as much as possible about the social surroundings of this Bijlmer Bias.
Yeah, I hear from our technical teams that we should wrap up.
Okay, good. I have one slide to go, if that's possible.
Yes.
Because I think it's important when you design a high-tech or semi-high-tech urban greenhouse that you will know that there are a lot of experts around, people that kind of are knowledgeable about food producing in that setting. So there should be it should be run by a management and by staff and by kind of producers who actually do the work. And I think you should reflect a little bit on if you bring in then kids, or you bring in consumers, or you bring in citizens as co-producers, how do they kind of relate to that farmers, to that urban food producers that are officially there? I think that's important in terms of rights and responsibilities of the different groups of people. So lay versus expert roles and knowledges is something to consider. The other thing is, and you discussed it a little bit already with the frequency of interaction, I think it's important that you think about online virtual connections to the urban greenhouse and compare that with actually visiting and having co-presence and face-to-face interaction in and around the greenhouse. I think there should be reflections on how you make use of both ways of connecting people to the urban greenhouse practices. And then my final statement, if you then design some roles for citizen consumers in your urban greenhouse, think about a nice balance between this kind of more passive distance and kind of, being connected but not very active, versus the kind of active, close by and powerful forms of co-creation. So you could kind of think about different roles that you try to combine in your design, so that you not think only about a greenhouse that is completely under the control and run by the population, with no experts and so on, and the people that are owning the place, or that you say, well, this is an expert tower that is run by food specialists, and people can just come and buy the food, and that's it. So there should be something in between, and you have to find the right balance. I think with that, we try to finalize the webinar. I had some further readings and watchings for the student teams to do. So I already mentioned the thesis of Erik Bos, and
is it available online or?
I will make it available via you.
Yeah.
There is this MOOC on co-creating sustainable cities that
we have already shared that.
And there's some further literature on what this social practice is about, because that's a topic that I used during the presentation. I think practices are key in designing roles for citizen consumers, but maybe it's good to have the social scientist of the team to dive a bit into
Okay.
the literature that's mentioned there.
Okay. By the way, I see that Josemar has already downloaded the thesis of Eric, so
Oh,
it's available online
good.
and easy to find.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's a very nice, and you can also mail Erik himself because he would like to. So I think we have two statements for discussion, but this is something as a take-home message for you. I think we already touched upon it, that I would have the invitation to you to think about the license to produce food in an urban greenhouse. It depends on the social embedding of the greenhouse. That's the kind of the statement that I would like to make with this presentation. And then the second main point have been that the need for urban sustainability, it opens up many new roles for citizen consumers co-creating urban greenhouses, so that you don't think about the greenhouses only in terms of food roles, but as well about roles in sustainability. I think that was the message that we had for you. And Marta, are you going to say goodbye and
Yes,
thanks? Okay.
yes, yeah. Well, I think a lot of food for thought for the teams, many new aspects to consider, hopefully also some explanation on the topics that we discussed before. Thanks a lot for your participation, all your questions. I will ask Gert to answer some of the remaining questions in a written form,
Yeah.
if it's possible.
And
So-
also, if the teams have a kind of questions for me, they can send it by email.
Okay, to us.
Yeah,
and we'll
and then-
forward
and then
it.
we will,
yeah.
d-
So
deal
don't
with
contact her directly.
No,
Contact
please.
us. Yes. The recording of this webinar, as well as the other ones, it will be available online. So I will share it with you soon, the link. And I would like to ask you to applause Gert silently via the chat function. And I would like to thank you very much for
Well,
this
it was a pleasure.
presentation.
I hope it helps the teams to improve their thinking about the design. And
Yeah.
I'm really curious to see what comes out of it.
No, great. Thanks
Okay,
a lot.
thank you.
Okay, so I applaud it. Thank you.